And so Jonah responds by jumping in a boat and fleeing in the other direction as quickly as he can. Now, this was a story that had always resonated with me ever since I was about 3 years old, and I was a really stroppy child, and so my parents actually nicknamed me Jonah the Moaner. But while I sat there listening to that talk, my heart, it just began to pound in my chest, as likewise, I strongly felt God asking me to do something that I really didn't want to do, which was to end a relationship with somebody who I'd been dating for over a year, but who wasn't a Christian, and who I knew deep in my heart, this was not the relationship that God intended me for, and it wasn't honoring him. So what did I do? Well, I decided to take a page out of the prophet Jonah's book and follow his excellent example, and so I ran away. Literally, I ran away. In my desperation, I abandoned both my parents' car and my 14-year-old sister in the middle of the English countryside at this campsite, and I paid £100 to catch a 4-hour train and flee back to my boyfriend at home. And one of my friends, who saw the kind of emotional state that I was in and wanted to help me, but she just didn't know how, she went out and she panic bought me an entire chocolate fudge cake, which she handed to me as I got on the train along with a fork. Thankfully, unlike Jonah, I didn't get swallowed by an enormous fish, but I did swallow that entire cake. In fact, I spent the next 4 hours on the train being stared at by random strangers who just didn't know what to do with this 18-year-old girl who was weeping hysterically as she ate her way through an entire giant chocolate cake. Now, that is a true story. It's also a ridiculous story and a tragic one. Because despite supposedly loving God, I just couldn't bear to do things his way when it came to the question of how I should handle my love life. Truthfully, the answer to this question today, does God care about my sex life, is a clear and simple one. Yes, he really does. He cares. But while the Bible might be very clear that God does care about our sex lives, I think for many of us, the much harder question to answer is not does he care, but why would he care? And should he care? And why is it such a big deal to him anyway? With the rest of our time together, it's those questions that I want to dig into a little bit more deeply. And the first response that I want to give you is this. Everybody else cares about your sex life, so why wouldn't God? Now, as human beings, we can get a little bit indignant about the idea of God having an opinion on our sex life or making moral judgments about who we sleep with. And yet when we speak that way, we risk sounding very hypocritical. Because the truth is that every single person in this room believes that there are right ways and wrong ways to use sex. We may not all agree on what those right and wrong ways are, but you can bet that we all draw the line somewhere. I drove past a sign on the road the other day that was advertising a website called maritalaffairs.com, UK's #1 website for affairs, where the grass is always greener, apparently. Now, whoever runs that website obviously doesn't care too much. But when I saw that sign, I felt sick to my stomach at the way they were encouraging people to commit adultery with no regard for the relationships or lives that would be torn apart in the process. And I think that most of us would feel the same way about it as well, that cheating is wrong, and if someone we were close to was either cheating or being cheated on, we would at the very least feel extremely uncomfortable about it. Or to give another, perhaps even clearer example, I honestly don't think there's anybody here who wouldn't agree that forced sex is always wrong, that rape is wrong. My point is this: we may draw the line in different places, but we all make moral evaluations about how sex should be used. So why then should we be surprised that God might have an opinion on the subject too? And even more than that, as the one who not only created us, but who designed sex itself as a gift for us, not only does God have a right to have an opinion on the subject, but he also is the only one who has the right opinion on the subject. Which is why he leaves clear instructions for his creation, explaining what sex is made for, right on the first pages of the Bible. Or we're given this vision of sex in the context of marriage, in the joining together of one man and one woman as one flesh in a permanent, faithful, monogamous relationship. Now, In our 21st century society, this is a radical message to hear, and it actually cuts across a lot of our cultural beliefs. But we shouldn't be surprised by these different attitudes and these different perspectives that we find between human culture and the way that God sees it. Because every people group will be wrong about sex. We all live in imperfect cultures, and throughout history, from one generation to the next, humanity's view on sexuality has always been in flux. It waxes and it wanes. Back in ancient Israel, for example, men often ignored God's ideal for marriage by taking more than one wife, or consider the culture of the ancient Greeks, where older mentors were actively encouraged to have sex with their pupils, or the Victorian era of the 20th century that was famous for its repressive attitude towards sex, even in the context of marriage. In a world like ours, where our views are always changing and all of us are products of our own cultures, it's God alone who remains the one unchanging, eternal standard. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that although some human cultures are going to line up more closely with God's perspective than others, that none of them are going to get it exactly right. And our own culture is no exception. These days, we live in a world that seems even more determined than ever to divorce ourselves from God's vision for sex. Many have come to see Christianity's attitude towards sex as archaic, as repressive, and as a complete bore. After all, isn't love supposed to be about freedom? I'm sure we've all heard the expression, if you love someone, you're supposed to set them free. So why then, if God supposedly loves us so much, doesn't he give us the freedom to freely express ourselves sexually in any way that we like? But I want to suggest that while this idea may sound really attractive in theory, that kind of love can actually be incredibly destructive in practice. Imagine that I see one of my best friends drunk at a party and she's running towards the edge of a roof because she's convinced that she can fly. Now, what would be the more loving thing for me to do in that situation? Should my love for her set her free? Or should I go racing towards the edge to fling my arms around her and grab her back because I know that contrary to her optimistic beliefs, gravity is definitely going to win that one, and the only freedom she'll be experiencing is the freedom to hit the ground too hard and too fast. When it comes to sex, Christianity teaches that this is the kind of situation we're in. We think we're living free, we think we can fly, but what we don't realize is that we're using our freedom at the risk of breaking both ourselves and others. If you doubt that, just take a look at what has happened since the sexual revolution of the 1960s, when as a Western society we removed God from the equation and we tried to abandon his sexual parameters. And what have we to show for ourselves? We see heartbreak on a daily basis, rising divorce rates and unfaithfulness, disease, unprecedented levels of pornography addictions, increasing rates of abortion, and shocking statistics of sexual slavery. For example, in the United States alone, 100,000 girls and women are forced into prostitution each year. And the average age of those girls in sexual slavery is 12 to 14 years old. And I think when we look at how bleak that picture is it so hard to believe that God might care and care deeply enough about the ways that we use sex. And because of the care that he has for us, he might actually want to set some clear boundaries and parameters around sex, not because he's a killjoy, not because he's trying to spoil our fun, but because he desires for each one of us to live full and flourishing lives. And the best way that we can do that is when we treat sex the way it was created to be treated. Because the thing is, sex always says something. Maybe you're thinking, all right, Joe, I hear what you're saying. Sure, when we look at cases like sex trafficking or adultery, we can see why God would want to put some rules around that. But what about more harmless examples? What about two people who aren't hurting anyone? They're just young and they've fallen in love and they want to be faithful to each other, at least for a while. What's so wrong with having sex in that kind of relationship? When Vince and I got married, we had a lot of friends who weren't Christians and who thought we were completely crazy for waiting until our wedding night to have sex. And just before our wedding, one of those friends, Jen, she gave us a wedding card that we opened in front of her, and then we immediately burst out laughing. And Jen looked kind of offended that we were laughing at her card. So we turned it around to show her what she'd written. And I think she'd meant to write, "Wishing you all the best." But obviously at the time of writing the card, she must have been thinking about how weird it was that we hadn't had sex yet, because what she actually wrote in the card was, "Wishing you all the sex." Definitely our favourite wedding card. But the reason why Christians don't just treat sex casually is because they believe that sex is not random, that actually it's designed. It has a purpose. And within that design, God actually gave sex an intrinsic and unchangeable meaning that can't be stripped away from it just because we want to use it differently or devalue it or treat it casually. Nor do I think it's a coincidence that when we refer to sex, we often talk about sexual intercourse, because intercourse means to be in conversation. It means to say something. And whether we intend it to or not, sex always says something. Just like "I love you" is the most intimate statement in our verbal language, sex is quite clearly the most intimate statement in our physical language. That's why the Bible calls it becoming one flesh, because you literally cannot get closer to another person. And it's in the giving of yourself to the other that it goes beyond something physical to symbolize something so much deeper. When you have sex, it's a way of physically saying to each other, "All of me, but all of you, always." All of me, but all of you, always. And that's a meaning that won't change just because we want it to. Imagine if I came up to you one day and I told you that from now on, whenever I want to tell you that I think you look nice, I'm going to say to you, "You're really ugly, you repulse me, get out of my face." So the next time I saw you, I came up to you and I said, "You're really ugly, you repulse me, get out of my face." How are you going to feel about that? Will you feel good? Will you feel valued by me? I don't think you will. Just because I tell you I want to change the meaning of a word, it doesn't mean that those words aren't going to instinctively hurt you when you hear them. Because I just don't have that kind of power to make them mean something else when deep down you know the truth of their meaning. And it's the same with sex. In our culture, we keep trying to redefine it, but it doesn't change the fact that at the deepest level, when we have sex with somebody, whether consciously or not, it feels like it's so much more than a casual hello. It feels like a huge promise. In the movie Vanilla Sky, Cameron Diaz plays a woman who's abandoned by her boyfriend for somebody else. And when he's breaking up with her, in her misery, she expresses the sense of betrayal she feels when she cries out to him, "Don't you know that when you sleep with somebody, your body makes a promise, whether you do or not?" And I think she's right. This is precisely why, when relationships that have been sexual don't work out, there's usually such a deep sense of having been lied to, betrayed, and violated. It feels like the worst sort of broken promise. Sometimes we say things to each other we don't mean, we lie to each other, or we say something to somebody's face and then we say something else behind their back, and that's really hurtful. But isn't it exactly the same when we have sex with each other without meaning by it what it's designed to mean, that I'm making a lifelong, unconditional commitment to you? Whenever we do that, what we're essentially doing is we're lying to each other. And that's why saving sex for marriage is such a powerful thing. Because you can know that when the time actually comes, having sex will mean precisely what it actually feels like it means and what it really does mean. A beautiful promise to your spouse, "All of me, but all of you, always." And if sex really means so much to God, then suddenly the question of how far is too far no longer seems like the right kind of question to be asking when it comes to our sex lives. Instead, actually a better question would be, how pure is too pure? So often it can feel like Christians treat dating as just a waiting room for sex, or kind of a sprint to the finish line. But actually, rather than feeling frustrated about what you can't do, I would just love to encourage you to get excited about the unique opportunity you have of giving the gift of purity to the person you're dating, because purity is a beautiful gift. And it's also a unique one because it's one you actually can't give to someone after you're married to them. In the context of dating, purity is a gift that says to somebody that as much as I would love to have sex with you already, you're worth waiting for. It says that you're worth sacrificing for. It's a gift that says, I care more about loving you well and helping you become the person you were made to be, thank you, than about gratifying my own immediate sexual desires. And significantly, purity is also a gift to your current boyfriend or girlfriend and to his or her future spouse, even if that winds up not being you. It's funny how often we take into consideration the way our actions affect other people when we're in different places. Sometimes you'll hear people saying things like, out of sight, out of mind, or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But the truth is, most of us don't really believe that to be true. I may be in Canada this weekend while my husband is at home in Oxford, but there's no doubt that anything that happens to Vince in Oxford will undoubtedly affect our relationship, whether I'm physically there or not. But if we think this way when we're separated by distance from somebody, why don't we think about our actions in the same way when we're separated by time? Why wouldn't I think that what I do at 15 will affect the person I'm married to at 30? Because the truth is, whether you wish it to or not, it really does. And that's why I'm a huge fan of this great piece of advice. Do to your girlfriend or boyfriend what you would want another to be doing to your future wife or husband. But what then should we do if we've already said far more than we ever meant to say? Or if others have made physical promises to us that they've broken, and they've broken us in the process as well? What if we've messed up? You know, perhaps you've been sitting here listening to me talking about purity, and it sounds like such a nice idea, but it just leaves you with this aching feeling inside, because deep down you know that you haven't lived up to God's ideal for your sex life, and the guilt is eating you alive. Perhaps you've even tried to change things, but you just feel stuck in habits that you can't break. Or perhaps you said sorry to God a long time ago, but that deep sense of shame just won't go away. And every time you hear talks like this, all you feel is this sense of condemnation and unworthiness, because you look around at the people around you and you think, wow, they look so pure, and yet I feel so used up and like I've nothing left to give. And if that's how you're feeling, then I just want you to know that it doesn't have to be that way anymore. That is not the life that God has for you, and actually He wants to set you free from feeling that way. And I can say that to you with confidence because I've been through that process with God myself. At the age of 18, I felt like my relationship with God was collapsing around me, and I was the one who'd messed it up. Not stopping at running away on that train, I also ran from God's desires for my love life and for my sex life too. And I did things that even at the time I actually deeply regretted, because I knew in my heart that it wasn't what God wanted for me, and it wasn't His best. And then even when I came back to God and I tried to cling to the belief that He would forgive me, it didn't change the fact that I actually just couldn't forgive myself. I was secretly drowning in shame, and I kind of felt like I couldn't breathe. And all the while on the surface, I was just pretending to be this perfect, good pastor's kid, because I couldn't bear for anyone to see through me to what was really going on inside. And then a few years after that, I met Vince. But even though I was excited about him, I was also deeply afraid, because I thought that once he knew the truth about me and who I really was and what I'd done, that he wouldn't want me anymore. And so, preferring to get dumped sooner rather than later, because I'm kind of melodramatic that way, I decided to tell him before we got too far into our relationship and I got too attached. But as I told him, I was just so ashamed, and I couldn't look him in the eye, so instead I just stared at the ground with tears rolling down my face. And then he said to me, "Joe, look at me." But I was like, "No, I can't." I just kept on crying, because I was terrified that when I looked into his eyes, all I would see would be judgment, condemnation, or anger. But then he said again, "Joe, look at me." And then he took my face in his hands and he raised it until we were looking eye to eye. And then he said to me, "That is not who you are anymore. That is not who you are anymore." And you know, it was in that moment that I finally got it. When I looked into his eyes and I didn't see anger or disappointment, and I just saw love. And all those years, you know, I've been so scared to look at God, because I was afraid to see condemnation or judgment or disappointment in his eyes. But seeing Vince's response for the first time, I understood how God really looks at me. And it finally sunk in that when Jesus dies on the cross, and when we accept that death of his for us, then it's as if God takes our face in his hands and he raises it until we're looking at him eye to eye. And then he says to us, that is not who you are anymore. That's why the Bible says there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And that's why Christians are described as new creations, because when we come before God with our shame and our mess, he lifts that from us and he puts it on himself at the cross and he wears it for us. And in the process, he sets us free. So if you know that that is you, if you just know, I've been so weighed down by this, and you've even pulled away from God because you're scared, you're just afraid that if you dared look into his eyes, what would he say and what would you see? And you felt so unlovely and unlovable. If that's the case, then I'm just going to take a quick moment to pray before we go into Q&A. And as I do, if that's a prayer you need to pray, just pray that with me quietly. But just as we do pray, just hear these words from your Father who loves you. He says, see, I make all things new. That is not who you are anymore. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that your love for us is unshakable, that you know us fully. You see every part of us, even the broken places, even the places where we just feel choked up with shame, and you love us just the same. We're sorry for the ways that we haven't lived up to your call, to the life that you made for us to live, and for the ways that we've misused and devalued the good gifts that you've given us. I thank you that on the cross that Jesus took all that mess and all that shame and all that brokenness and he wore it himself so we could be free. And I thank you that because of that, because of what you've already done, it's already been dealt with and there really is no condemnation for those who are in Jesus. We ask to receive that gift of forgiveness from you now and to know for ourselves the freedom that you died to bring us and that new life that you won for us. And I just pray that for every person here who desires it, that you would speak over them those words of transformation and acceptance, that that's not who they are anymore. Amen.